Before we begin our journey on this peaceful night, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always delightful to discover where our listeners rest their heads as they travel with us through these old memories. Vinegar and Urine Perfumes, when scent was medicine. I remember a woman named Imelda, a lady of long embroidered skirts and knot-filled kerchiefs, who lived in one of the last stone houses at the edge of the village, where the wind seemed to whisper softer and the church bells yawned like iron sighs. I was just a boy then, curious and slender like a stalk of wheat, spending my mornings helping my father sell vinegars and scented waters. But it was in the afternoons, when the sun slanted behind thatched rooftops, that I would wait to see her appear with her vials, her amber bottles, and that gaze that seemed to carry ancient secrets. Imelda didn't come to buy. She came to teach. And I, quiet and watchful, learned more from her than anywhere else. Her scent, I recall vividly, was like dry leaves soaked in acid rain, sharp and sweet all at once, as if the entire autumn were folded beneath her shawl. She used to say that the sense of smell was the key to survival, that those who could smell could live. While other women turned to dried flowers or boiled elderberries, Imelda preferred what she called internal remedies. And so it was, on a rust-colored evening, that she shared her most curious belief, that urine, when used with respect and intention, could cleanse not only the body, but the invisible ills of the soul. I recoiled in disgust, or tried to, but she only smiled as one who had seen many grimaces before mine. I remember how she opened one of her tiny bottles, wrapped in cloth embroidered with symbols like stars and flowers, and released a dense cloud of scent. It was pungent, acidic, and yet enveloping, like the steam of a strong soup on a cold day. Red apple vinegar, dried rose petals, and a drop of what is mine, she whispered, like someone revealing a sacred recipe. She said that in the days when the plague crept through the fields, that scent drove away fear, and with luck, the illness too. It's the body teaching itself to defend, she said, gently dabbing the liquid on her temples and wrists, as though invoking an invisible blessing. At that time, baths were rare, almost legendary, and people said that to open your pores was to open the gates to the devil. So scent became shield, ritual, an invisible armor against others' stares and the judgment of the gods. The village women, even the vainest, came to Imelda in secret, asking for strong essences, vinegars with garlic or thyme, whispered instructions on how to keep the air around them more trustworthy than their own skin. And although many mocked her in public, behind closed doors, they sprinkled essences on their handkerchiefs, kept sealed clay jars in their cupboards, and hoped the scent would outrun death. There was something magical, or perhaps just deeply human, in the belief that scent could deceive the plague. Imelda taught me that when trust in the purity of water faded, all that remained was faith in fragrance. "If the world stinks," she would say with a half-smile, "then let us stink with purpose." She spoke with the same calm firmness with which she sewed, as if she knew that living meant walking the tightrope between what could be controlled and what was simply mist and fate. Her formulas became a sort of courage potion, not to cure disease, but to give meaning to waiting, to doubt, to the silence between one bad news and the next. As months passed, I began to recognize the combinations. Vinegar with lavender to keep dark thoughts at bay. Vinegar with mint to ease the breath. And the most curious, vinegar with a trace of one's own urine aged under the sun, to ward off envious eyes, as she said. A ritual, almost a dance between superstition and intuition, where every gesture held weight. Some women anointed their pillows with it, others dripped it onto the collars of their dresses before visiting the market. But Imelda said the secret was simple. You had to believe in scent, as one believes in a candle during a storm. It may not save, but it soothes. It was on one of those overcast days, when the bells tolled for someone lost, that I saw Imelda prepare her most special bottle. The village was shrouded in an uneasy silence, and the fireplace smoke hung heavier than usual. She called me into her kitchen, a room of uneven stones, with herbs dangling from the ceiling and light filtering through faded cloths, and pointed to a ceramic bowl in the center of the table. "Today, the scent must be stronger than fear," she murmured. She mixed aged apple cider vinegar, shavings of dried lemon peel, a handful of cloves, and, with a serene, almost reverent gesture, a thread of urine collected early that morning, before the body had been corrupted by the day. She stirred the blend with a wooden stick and let it rest by the open window so the night breeze could touch it like a blessing. She said that if the world insisted on reminding us of death at every corner, then we must answer with scents that remind us of life. "The body speaks, my boy," she whispered while embalming small pieces of linen with the liquid, "and everything it expels carries some wisdom, even if it repulses us." That night, she laid the cloths over the thresholds of neighboring homes, discreetly, like someone sewing the invisible. No one noticed, or perhaps they pretended not to. But that week, for the first time in many months, no one fell ill. After that, Imelda was seen with a kind of cautious respect. People still wrinkled their noses when passing her, but now with less disdain and more curiosity. Some left dried flowers on her doorstep. Others asked, as if not wanting an answer, if she still made her protection perfumes. And she continued, serene as time itself, distilling her recipes between the flicker of candles and the pounding of stone pestles. For me, she always set aside a tiny bottle, wrapped in cloth and tied with twine, filled with a new blend, a new idea born from sleep or dream. She used to say scents held memory, and that one only had to breathe deeply to remember who they were, or who they longed to be. Once, I asked if she truly believed it could ward off illness. She smiled without showing her teeth, eyes half closed as if peering inward, and replied, "It may not keep the plague away, but it calms the heart, and that's enough to heal a little." With time, I began to understand. Imelda's formulas weren't only for the body, but for the spirit, a kind of charm against despair, against the invisible weight of living between funerals and whispers. Every drop of vinegar, every petal steeped, every human trace carefully blended was, at heart, a gesture of resistance, a reminder that even in filth there is dignity. Winters came and went, each bringing its own silence and its own absences. And with them I saw Imelda age like an oak tree, more bent, slower, but still deeply rooted. Her hands trembled a bit more, but she continued preparing her bottles with the same delicacy as before, as if embroidering the air with patience. When the plague finally ceased, and the wagons no longer passed with their funeral bells, many credited the calm to the priest's prayers or new council laws. But I, and a few who had learned to listen beyond words, knew that there were also Imelda's cloths, the anointed thresholds, the vinegar vapors laced with faith. The last time I saw her, she handed me a small bottle, round as a walnut, filled with amber liquid that shimmered under the lamplight. "For when the world loses the scent of hope," she said, closing my hand around the glass. I was nearly a man, and she was nearly mist, so light it seemed she might vanish into the wind. She never returned to the shop, and they say that one night she simply disappeared, leaving only a lingering scent in the air, something between moss, iron, and ripe apple. A scent that to this day, when I close my eyes and inhale deeply, reminds me that to resist is sometimes just to keep perfuming the world with whatever little you have. Now, many years later, I still keep that bottle on the highest shelf of my bookcase, wrapped in the same old cloth, faded by time. I've never opened it, not out of fear, but out of reverence. It remains there as a reliquary of all that cannot be explained, intuitive wisdom, the knowledge of forgotten women, the small rituals that protected not with sword, but with scent. Sometimes, when the night is especially quiet, I like to believe Imelda still wanders through the villages of distant lands, leaving traces of vinegar and courage on half-open windows, teaching those who are willing to listen that there is power in the simplest of things, even in what the world discards. And so I fall asleep, cradled by these memories of amber glass, embroidered cloths, and words whispered like prayers. For even when everything seemed to fall apart, faith, health, certainty, there was always a persistent scent in the air, as if someone out there was saying, "It's not over yet." And perhaps that's what keeps us going. The comfort of a familiar smell, the memory of an invisible gesture, the gentle presence of someone who has gone, but never truly vanished. Good night, dear listener. May your sleep be deep and your dreams tender, and if ever fear comes knocking, may you find an old bottle close at hand, with a scent that brings you peace. Dresses sewn to the skin, when clothes never came off. I remember a winter so silent that even the bells seemed to hesitate before ringing. The fields around the convent lay beneath a thin sheet of frost, and the only constant sound was the rustle of dry leaves carried by the cold breeze that slipped through the cracks of the high windows. I was young then, young and curious, with hands that smelled of wax and stale bread, and eyes that peeked at the world through the folds of stiff habits. We lived in the monastery of Saint Odelgada, 12 sisters and a prioress, as old as the oak pews where we prayed. And it was there that I met the woman who never removed her dress. Her name was Sister Lys, and she seemed made of silence and shadow. Tall, slender, and always wrapped in the same brown woolen folds, she would appear and disappear through the halls, like a candle about to go out. Her hands were steady with embroidery, but her eyes, oh, her eyes, carried the weight of a secret no one dared to touch. They said she had taken a vow of enclosure in her youth, and that since then, her tunic had never left her skin. Some sisters said it was out of humility, others out of penance, but I, still naive and dreamy, imagined there was some sort of enchantment in her, as if the fabric had fused with her body by the will of time itself. Sister Lys's clothes were not like ours, changed with the seasons or washed with warm water and ash soap. They were always the same, hems mended by hand, ancient stains tinted by time into colors somewhere between rust and wine. The fabric gave off a peculiar smell, not foul, just old, like forgotten pages from a prayer book. I used to watch her silently as she stitched her sleeves to her wrists, small, firm stitches, as if embroidering secret upon secret. "It's to keep the world out," I once heard whispered behind me by Sister Matilda. "The skin holds vapors. Sometimes the air slips through the seams and makes us ill." At first, I thought it was just one of those foolish superstitions told to scare novices. But over the months, I began to sense a deeper kind of faith in her ritual. Sister Lys did not eat with the others. She carried with her a small wooden bowl with darkened bread and boiled roots, and she would sit beneath the image of Saint Dymphna, her eyes cast downward. I never saw her laugh. I never heard her cough. She seemed to hover between the world of the living and some quieter realm, where bodies were neither touched nor exposed, only endured. What was strangest, though, was how no one, not even the prioress, dared confront her. There was reverence, or perhaps fear, and a chill that ran up my spine every time I crossed the corridor after the Compline bell. It was on a late spring afternoon that everything changed. The fields had begun to green again, and the convent windows were open to let in the sweet scent of wildflowers. I was helping the prioress arrange the mantles for the procession of St. Bartholomew when a whisper moved through the halls like wind before rain. Sister Lys had collapsed near the altar, her body motionless like a fallen stole. We ran, sandals slapping against the cold stones, and found her there, eyes closed, forehead damp, as if time had finally come to collect its debt. The prioress ordered us to take her to the infirmary, a small, windowless room where we kept lavender water and honey salves. As we laid her on the straw mat, we tried to loosen her tunic, but the seams wouldn't budge. The stitches were tightly woven into her skin, like roots gripping stone. The sisters hesitated, whispering prayers and crossing themselves, but the prioress, calm and firm, asked for scissors. And then, for the first time in many years, the wool gave way. And with it, something else was released, a dense, warm scent, like earth after rain. And a silence so thick even the candle seemed to flicker with caution. Beneath the layers of fabric, we found not only skin, but time itself. Her flesh was pale like curdled milk, mottled with dark patches and tiny wounds that had made their home beneath the cloth. Lice, unhurried, crawled like pilgrims across her shoulders and neck. There were old scabs, stains, and a sort of moist dust that clung to our fingers like cold ash. Some sisters stepped away, others wept softly. I stayed, not out of courage, but because I simply couldn't look away. There was something heartbreakingly human in that sight, a whole life kept under folds no one had dared to undo. The prioress, with sorrowful eyes and careful hands, kept cutting, as if unthreading the veil of a story long buried. As we removed the final strips, something changed in Sister Lisa's face. She did not wake, but her lips curved into a faint smile. Perhaps she felt the relief of fresh air, or perhaps in her dream she wandered fields where no one had to cover themselves. We spent days tending to her, washing her wounds with calendula and honey, combing her hair as if she were a sleeping child. She never told us why she kept her dress bound to her skin. When she awoke, weeks later, she simply smiled with a gentleness we had never seen. And then, as if closing a chapter, she asked for a new tunic. Loose this time, she said, with wooden buttons, ones I can open myself if the wind comes in. And so we made it. From that day on, Sister Liz was different. Or perhaps she was finally herself, only freed. She walked the cloisters with slow, steady steps and accepted apples from the orchard with a gentle nod. She spent her mornings in the shade of the vines, sewing light garments for the novices, fabrics that breathed with the body, that danced with the breeze. And when asked about the past, she would only say, "There are garments we wear on the inside, and those often weigh more than wet wool." No one insisted. It was as if everyone understood deep down that some silences deserved to be kept like relics. The convent was never the same. Clothes were washed more often, and hot herb baths ceased to be seen as threats to the soul. The novices, once so fearful of the world's touch, learned to trust in air, in sunlight, even in rain. And I, who once watched Sister Liz through the curious eyes of a girl, grew to understand that there are many ways to clothe a body. Some out of faith, others out of pain. But there is also the choice to one day let the wind undo us. And that, I learned from her, is a grace as delicate as a needle-piercing linen. There was one afternoon, late in summer, when I saw her sitting at the edge of the well, washing her feet with a near-ceremonial gentleness. The sky was embroidered with thin clouds, and the scent of freshly picked mint hung in the air. She hummed a soft melody, a song I didn't recognize, perhaps learned before her vows, or invented in the solitude of nights spent sewing silence. I remember pausing at a distance, not wanting to interrupt the moment. For the first time, Sister Liz seemed wholly present, as if each gesture, dipping her hand, wringing the cloth, drying her heel, was a new kind of prayer, spoken not with words, but with a rediscovered body. Years later, she passed away peacefully, on a morning when the bells felt lighter and the sky slowly brightened above the thatched roofs. She died in her cell, between freshly washed sheets and a simple tunic folded at the foot of her bed. She left no letters, no keepsakes, only a bone needle and a length of linen thread hanging on the wall, a reminder that some burdens can be unstitched. Each spring, we place flowers on her grave in the convent garden, and the younger sisters learn, without haste, that to dress in lightness is also a kind of vow, a vow that allows us to breathe. And I, now old, still keep in my wooden box a scrap of her last tunic, a small piece from the hem where the sun faded the brown into something between straw and amber. When the days feel too long or the winter presses on my chest, I hold that cloth in my hands and close my eyes. I can feel it warming slowly, as if it still held the memory of the body it once carried in silence. And I think of how many things we wear without noticing, fears, guilt, beliefs stitched with invisible thread, and how it takes courage to one day let them go. That was Sister Lise, a body long hidden, but whose presence marked our souls like stained glass casting light on evening floors. She was no saint nor martyr, only human, deeply human, and that, I believe, was the most sacred thing she left behind. Today, when the wind blows through the convent windows and stirs the linen curtains, I like to think she still passes through, free, weightless, wearing a tunic that dances with the air. And perhaps, just perhaps, she has finally learned to sing out loud. Lead bleaches, the perilous pursuit of pale skin. I remember her, like one remembers a dream by a distant hearth. The woman who lived in the palest tower on the hill, a tower that seemed itself built of flower and moonlight. Her name was Lady Aveline, and the villagers said her skin was as white as milk left out in the dew. At dusk, when the sun slipped behind veils of mist, she would sit by the window, her face turned to the wind, still as a sculpture, shrouded in translucent veils that never quite revealed her fully. It was whispered, in broken promises and hushed tones, that her whiteness came not from noble blood or the chill of stone, but from an ancient recipe, a thick mixture of barley flour, white vinegar, and a powder that shimmered like ashes beneath moonlight. It was lead oxide, though no one dared speak that name with sorrow back then. To the ladies of court, it was merely a touch of elegance, the secret of a beauty that seemed otherworldly. And Aveline, with soft hands and a whispering voice, would apply the paste each night as if writing secrets into her very skin. They said it had to remain on her face until dawn, when the roosters crowed and the fog began to rise from the fields. Aveline would then rinse it away with infusions of dried petals and greet her reflection with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who had defeated time. But the more observant noticed the signs: ever-heavy eyelids, smiles that faded more quickly, and a subtle trembling in her hands by day's end, as if some ancient winter stirred within her. In the village, no one dared speak of it. Her pallor was revered, a sacred veil between the living and those who longed not to be touched by the world's impurities. Younger women tried to imitate the habit with gentler blends: crushed eggshells, fermented goat milk, a touch of ash, but none achieved Aveline's translucence, that parchment-like hue, as if her skin preserved forgotten prayers. And so, the lady in the tower remained, growing ever more distant, like a portrait fading under the weight of time and gaze. But there was a maid named Maud, a simple girl, freckled shoulders, eyes the color of new leaves, who had cared for Lady Aveline since childhood. She prepared the pastes with careful hands, mixing powders in clay bowls, warming vinegar over gentle coals. But with time, Maud began to hesitate. She saw hidden sores beneath the chin, bruised wrists, and more than once found Aveline murmuring strange, disjointed phrases before the mirror, as if speaking to someone unseen. One afternoon, while changing the linens in the upper chamber, Maud found beneath her lady's pillow a thin line of dried blood, no thicker than the stroke of a quill. The silver mirror, once polished to perfection, was coated in a hazy film, as though refusing to reflect what it saw. And that very day, heart stumbling, Maud went down to the village and sought the old herbalist, a white-haired woman who spoke with the wind and kept forgotten wisdom sealed in amber jars. The herbalist listened in silence, eyes half closed, as though hearing not only the words, but the weight of the pauses between them. When Maud finished, the elder murmured something softly, perhaps an old prayer, and stepped to a crooked shelf. She returned with a handful of dried leaves and a dark clay jar. "It is no sin to wish to be beautiful," she said, in a voice like polished stone, "but some beauty calls with poison on its tongue." She gave Maud a balm of lavender, heather honey, and a nameless northern herb said to ward off snowborn delirium. Maud returned before moonrise. That night, while Aveline slept, she quietly hid all the jars of the old bleach. In their place, she left the new salve, gentler, golden with a sweet scent. In the morning, the lady of the tower noticed the change, but said nothing. She simply touched her cheek with slow fingers, as if listening to her skin with her fingertips. And for the first time in weeks, she asked that the window be left open, so the morning breeze could kiss her face, free of veils. In the days that followed, the silence of the tower was filled with gentle sounds. The creak of a chair dragged towards sunlight, the clink of spoons in herbal tea, and a brief, almost accidental laugh when Maud spoke of village markets or clumsy dogs. Aveline no longer wore veils, though her skin still bore the paleness of past years, now more like aged porcelain than cold marble. Over time, the spots faded, the tremors ceased, and her once glazed eyes blinked with quiet presence. The villagers watching from afar said something had changed, though they couldn't name it. She remained beautiful, no doubt, but it was a different kind of beauty, less distant, more human. She no longer seemed made of moonlight, but of warm bread, clean linens, and soft autumns. Some young women began to visit the herbalist, not in secret, but with flowers in their hair and honest coins in their palms. They asked for the lady's balm, the one that brought back voice, laughter, warmth. And so, without fuss or proclamation, the old recipe faded from memory, like snow that at last melts away. One morning, many years later, I found Maud seated by the well, spinning wool with calm fingers. Her hair was laced with white, but her eyes remained sharp, like someone who knows more than they say. I asked her, in gentle curiosity, if she still kept the old formula, the one so many ladies once used in pursuit of purity. She smiled without looking up and simply said, "I do, but only in the stories I tell those in a hurry." Then she returned to her spinning, as if weaving time itself with patience and care. As for Lady Aveline, her name slowly faded from courtly banquets and dances, but took root in folk songs and healers' notebooks. They said she planted violets on her windowsill and wrote letters she never sent, just to remind the words that beauty lies in being spoken, even without reply. When she passed, it was on a night of quiet fog, with candles still glowing and her feet wrapped warm. And they say, at least I like to believe, that a flush of color lingered on her cheeks, somewhere between dusk rose and golden honey. The tower where she lived still stands, though its upper floors have yielded to time and ivy. Yet the townsfolk keep the garden tended and place flowers at the old window ledge, not only in honor of a noble lady, but of a woman who chose to return to herself. And sometimes, when the northern wind carries the scent of herbs from that place, they say you can feel a light presence, like a memory that asks for no attention, only quiet company. And when the nights stretch long and the hearth dances its shadows on the walls, I like to remember that story, not for the sorrow held in its early chapters, but for the gentle tenderness with which it was closed. For there is beauty that glows like gold, and beauty that warms like wool. And it was the latter that Aveline, in the end, chose to drape over herself, with the help of a faithful friend's steady hands. May we, too, learn to trade mirrors for windows, and see ourselves in the light that shines from within. And so ends another memory, stitched in silence, like those sewn into old quilts, and the eyes of those who listen with a calm heart. Perhaps tonight, as you close your eyes, you'll picture the ivy-covered tower, the sound of leaves in the wind, or the distant scent of lavender and warm honey. And if you should dream of a pale lady smiling at her window, know that some stories ask not to be finished, only to rest. Sleep well wherever you are. May your dreams be light, your nights soft. And when you wake, may a trace of tenderness remain, like the last touch of sunlight on an old pane of glass. Reusable cloths, intimate care in times of scarcity. I remember well how summers seemed longer back then, not because of the heat, which came shy and brief, but because of the way time stretched between the simple rhythms of village life. I was only a girl, and we all lived under the same low wooden roof, where the constant scent of dried lavender mingled with the simmering pots on the fire. The house was small, with narrow windows and hand-stitched curtains, and yet it sheltered us with more than just walls. There was an old tenderness woven among the women of the family, like the cloths they folded together at the end of each day. My grandmother, with her light eyes and hands marked by cold winter soap, was the one who tended to the little rituals that preserved our dignity. One afternoon, as the rain tapped gently on the roof, she called me to help fold the cloths drying on the back fence. They weren't just fabric, they were silent companions, carefully washed, left to dry in the sun, and stored in boxes with rose petals and bits of sandalwood. Each woman in the house had her own, though in harder times they were shared, and there was no shame in that. Only a quiet sense of care and ancestral trust. We sometimes heard whispers in the village about women who used dry moss or scraps of wool, especially when winters made water rare or firewood scarce. But in our home, the cloths were treasures passed from mother to daughter, sewn with firm hems and small embroideries at the corners, not out of vanity, but out of memory. Each flower stitched told of a season, a story, or a difficult birth overcome. Details no one saw, yet we knew by heart. The feel of worn linen was almost as familiar as my mother's embrace at dusk. I will never forget the afternoon I received my first cloth. I had just turned 11, and the strange, warm feeling in my belly came with a fear that now I see was also the beginning of something sacred. My mother didn't say much, just smiled with the calm of one who has seen many moons, and opened her wooden box lined with dried flowers. From it, she took a small cloth, folded in 4, and handed it to me as one gives a key or a secret. "This is yours now," she said, her eyes shining with the sweetness of someone who understands both the weight and the lightness of the moment. I used that cloth with almost ceremonial care. I washed it with ash soap and warm water, then laid it to dry in the sun, pinned gently between the apple tree's branches. There was dignity in that gesture, as if, in caring for that little piece of fabric, I was also learning to care for myself. The other women in the house did the same, and slowly, almost without realizing, I became part of that quiet cycle of shared care. On the clothesline, the cloths danced like flags of an intimate and feminine territory, each fold carrying secrets and small victories of daily life. During the hardest days, when harvests failed or illness lingered near our garden, we knew we would have to share. I remember one night when my cousin arrived without warning, trembling with cold and shame after weeks working at a distant house. Her clothes were soiled, her eyes low, and she had no protection with her. My grandmother, without a word, opened her wooden box, chose the softest cloth, and handed it to her with steady hands. "Wash it with care and keep it with love," she said. And so, between women, we learned that what is intimate can also be generous. Over time, I realized those little cloths were more than simple tools of hygiene. They were witnesses to our silent pains, to the transformations we endured, and to the way we faced life with composure, even when everything around us felt scarce. There was beauty in the routine of boiling them in clay pots, hanging them in the sun with wooden pegs, and folding them slowly at dusk, when the crickets began to sing and the scent of dried flowers filled the house like a familiar song. We sometimes heard stories of women in other villages using large leaves or even rough paper when winters were too harsh to wash cloth. And whenever those stories reached us, we'd look at one another with a quiet kind of gratitude, not for luck, but for unity. Because even when the cloths were few, someone was always willing to share, not as a favor, but as a gentle duty, a gesture of trust among those who knew the weight of silence and the dignity that lives in the smallest things. There was one autumn in particular when it seemed the rain would never stop. Clothes took days to dry, and the stacked cloths waiting for sun smelled of damp fabric and the lingering scent of aged lavender. That season, my aunt fell ill, a fever that made her sometimes too still, sometimes restless, like one who speaks to ghosts. In her absence, we divided her cloths among us, and even without saying it aloud, we knew it wasn't just a practical act. It was a way to keep her close, to care for her indirectly through the things she had once tended with love. Later, when the skies cleared and the sheets once again danced in the breeze, she recovered slowly, like someone returning from a deep dream. Watching her walk to the fence to hang her first cloth with her own hands, I felt a quiet tenderness I could never quite explain. It was as if something had been renewed, not only in her, but in all of us. And there, among the smells of soap, wet wood and dried flowers, I understood that even the simplest objects can hold entire stories, and that sometimes in quiet, repeated care, the deepest bonds are woven. Years later, when I moved to my husband's house, I took with me a small wooden box, a silent inheritance from my mother and the women before her. Inside were my favorite cloths, edges now slightly frayed, with floral embroidery that had begun to fade softly. In my new home, they rested in the wardrobe beside the herbs I hung in the window, rosemary, vervain, and mint. And even amidst a different routine, far from the familiar voices, I only had to open that box and breathe in the old scent to feel my chest settle. It was like a whisper from home, reminding me who I was. In time, I taught my own daughters to care for their cloths, just as I had been taught. They listened with curious eyes, sometimes giggling at the stitches or the way I explained the folds, but on days of pain or confusion, they always ran to that box. And when, on a grey morning, I found a small cloth embroidered by my youngest, uneven flowers, crooked seams, I tucked it beside mine with the same reverence my mother had once shown me. For in that simple fabric rested the memory of a path walked with gentleness and courage. Sometimes I think of how many generations spent their days around those small rituals, washing, drying, folding, as if they stitched time with their very hands. The cloths, as fragile as they were, endured the seasons, the losses, the joys, and even the changes the world imposed on us without asking. And even when modern things arrived, thinner fabrics, new ideas, I kept my box where it was, untouched, like a reliquary from a time when care was slow and silence had meaning. Today, aged and at peace, I still open that box from time to time. Some fabrics are too worn to use, but each holds a chapter of who we were. I sit by the window, where the afternoon sun rests lightly on the old furniture, and let the scents and memories wrap around me like a soft shawl. There is peace in all this, an old tenderness that resists time. And as I listen to the wind rustling the leaves outside, I think perhaps dignity, that big word, truly lives in the smallest things, folded with care and kept with love. And so, I finish this little thread of memory, woven with the same care that so many women once gave to their cloths across the centuries. There is no grand heroism in these recollections, only everyday gestures, quiet sharing, and a deep respect for the body and for life. Things not taught aloud but learned slowly, by watching patient hands and listening to the unspoken. And maybe on nights like this, as we remember these moments with tenderness, we can understand that there is beauty in scarcity too, and nobility in simply caring. If this memory brought you a touch of warmth, I am grateful. May your rest tonight be as serene as the swaying cloths on the line, and may the dreams that find you carry the same gentle comfort as a wooden box lined with dried flowers. Good night, traveler. Sleep well, until our next story. Hair dyes, made of lime and urine, when vanity burned. I remember a golden afternoon at the end of an old summer when cicadas still sang in the mulberry trees and the scent of fresh mint dried on the windowsill. I lived with my great-aunt then, a woman of delicate gestures and eyes always half-closed, as if listening to something the rest of us could not hear. She used to comb my hair with a bone comb and tell me stories from her youth, stories of celebrations, embroidered veils, and vanities that stung more than anyone dared admit. It was a time when beauty came at a price, and sometimes that price arrived in steaming jars with a sharp smell and golden promises. In that dusty village of colorful clotheslines, where women washed their laundry in the river and hung their secrets alongside the sheets, there was a quiet tradition whispered among the most vain. It was said that the color of one's hair could change a young woman's fate, and that golden strands brought prestige, admiration, and even more generous marriage proposals. But it was rare to be born with hair like the angel in the chapel's stained glass. So homemade recipes passed from mouth to mouth like forbidden relics, and the most whispered and feared involved quicklime, ashes, and freshly collected urine. Some women gathered their urine in the morning when, they claimed, the vapors were still strong with potency. They mixed it with ground lime in stone mortars, adding sifted ash gathered from the previous night's fires. The paste, of an indistinct color and pungent scent, was stored in small clay pots and covered with cloths soaked in rose water. Perhaps a vain attempt to disguise the odor, or to soften the harshness of the ritual that followed. Sometimes, prayers were murmured during the preparation, not to bless beauty, but to beg that it wouldn't burn too much. I remember my cousin Iselotte, who once decided to follow the full ritual before the harvest fair. It was a pale morning, with mist slipping through the door cracks. She was seated beneath the sun in a straw chair, face lifted as the neighbors gathered around her like priestesses before an altar. They applied the paste to her brown hair, which was wrapped in a thick linen cap, open at the top so the sun could do its work. The smell flooded the house, sharp as old vinegar. Still, Iselotte smiled. A trembling smile, it's true, but filled with hope. The hours passed slowly, marked only by the buzz of bees and Iselotte's stifled sighs. From time to time, someone would bring a damp cloth to pat her forehead or fan her lap with a sprig of rosemary. She didn't complain, but her hands gripped the chair's arms with a firmness that betrayed the pain. Her scalp began to tingle, then to itch, and finally to burn, as though hot coals had been placed between the roots. "It means it's working," an old aunt whispered, in the same voice she used to call the chickens. When they finally rinsed the mixture with warm water and elderflower leaves, Iselotte could barely keep her eyes open. Her face was flushed from the heat, her eyes misty, and her hair, well, it was golden in places, yes, but also thin as straw, and some locks had fallen out as if too tired to continue. The cap was removed carefully, yet still pulled entire strands with it. Iselotte smiled anyway. A small, resigned smile, the kind that knows beauty sometimes costs more than it promises. In the days that followed, Iselotte spent much of her time sitting beneath the apple tree in the yard, a light scarf over her hair and a lavender infusion by her side. She said the sun felt good, that the warmth soothed the lingering sting. Some nights, her slow footsteps echoed in the corridor as she fetched apple cider vinegar or warm oil to ease her scalp. My great-aunt would prepare poultices with honey and egg yolk, applying them in silence and care, as if healing had become more about tenderness than vanity. Despite everything, Iselotta became a quiet legend in the village. When she passed through the fair, young men would glance at her hair, now lighter yet delicate like antique lace, with a mix of awe and pity. Young women whispered, trying to guess the exact formula, or whether she'd made promises to forgotten saints. But she simply smiled, wrapped in her new peace, like someone who had once carried the weight of expectation and chosen to put it down. Her scarf became her signature, and what little she let show glistened in the light, like wheat before the harvest. There was a time when neighbors came to ask her for advice, sitting beside her with clay pots and hopes in their eyes. She listened patiently, stirring herbs in her lap or serving chamomile tea. She never discouraged, nor did she encourage. She simply told her story the way she knew how, calmly, without embellishment. She'd say there were days when all she wanted was a golden glimmer in the well's reflection, and sometimes that was enough to justify the burn. Other times she admitted she missed her old hair, dark like the fig tree's bark. It was in that balance between pride and longing that Iselotta found her beauty again. Not in mirrors, but in the hands that now braided other girls' hair with care, in the words she shared with sweetness, and in the way she taught them that glow could also come from patience. She began sewing embroidered caps with small circular windows at the crown, in case some fool still wants to speak to the sun, she'd say with a laugh. These caps would later be sold at the fair, alongside jars of marmalade and lavender soaps, as gentle reminders of a vanity that had learned not to wound. The years passed, as seasons do, in silence, and Iselotta became a serene figure among us. The one children sought when knees were scraped, or when hearts ached for reasons they couldn't name. Her hair never returned to what it once was, but she kept it gracefully, tied in low buns, adorned with little wooden combs or sprigs of thyme. The smell of urine and lime had long since vanished, replaced by the soft fragrance of the herbs she grew along the fence. And though she seldom spoke of it, everyone knew there was a story there, one that had burned before it could soothe. One afternoon, beneath a pale sky and warm breeze, Iselotta called me into the shed where she kept her fabrics. She handed me a simple white linen cap, its edges gently embroidered, with a small circular opening at the top. "Not to wear, just to remember," she said with a smile carrying more tenderness than regret. I kept that cap as one keeps an entire season wrapped in cloth. The summer of hope, the autumn of scars, and the quiet winter of acceptance. And to this day, when the world feels heavy and night begins to fall, I think of her, and how, sometimes, the most enduring beauty comes from what we choose to leave behind. When winters grew longer and days more silent, Iselotta's steps grew shorter, though still firm. The young women who once came for advice now brought their daughters, and the stories repeated, not with sadness, but like old songs sung around a fire. The bench beneath the apple tree remained her favorite place, even as the wind swirled leaves at her feet. She said the cold brought clarity, and that it was easier to remember the important things when the world quieted down. Today, whenever someone asks me about beauty, about youth, or about remedies that promise more than they give, I think of Iselotta, and I think of the linen cap tucked between my books, with its little circle at the crown, a window for the sun, for the missteps, and for all that shapes us when we're not looking. Perhaps there is no true cure for human vanity, but there is comfort in sharing, in gentleness, and in the quiet acceptance of one who has known both sides of the same hope. And so I fall asleep, wrapped in that soft memory, like someone resting beneath an apple tree with the sweet scent of summer slowly returning. The bathing fast, when washing the body was a spiritual threat. I remember a particularly harsh winter in the village of Santo Berardo, where the wind cut like a knife and the embers in the hearth seemed to hesitate before offering warmth. The night stretched on, as if trying to swallow the days whole, and the fogged windows reflected only silence and contemplation. I was young then, and split my days between tending the abbey's chickens and shy visits to the monastery, where the sisters prayed in Latin and stitched veils that looked as though they were made of mist. There was a woman there whom few dared to name aloud, not out of fear, but reverence. They called her Sister Osberta, the oldest among the nuns, and the strangest in the eyes of the children. She was thin as a dried corn husk, and her steps made no sound on the stone floor. Her hair, which must once have been golden, was always hidden beneath a thick veil, stained by time and prayer. They said she had not bathed since the day of her consecration, more than 40 winters before, and not out of neglect, but as a vow. A water fast, they whispered. Let the flesh stink as the soul blossoms, was one of her sayings, which the younger ones repeated between giggles and chills. And yet, when she passed, carrying herbs or drawing water from the well for others, a hush followed her, as if even the wind respected her scent and her choice. They say that once a young novice named Elric, newly arrived from the southern lands, could no longer hold his curiosity and asked her why she refused water when even the saints washed their feet before supper. Sister Osberta took no offense. She merely smiled with tenderness, like one listening to the naivety of a bird, and replied, "Water cleanses the body, my child, but it also awakens the demons of vanity. I would rather heaven recognize me by the scent of penitence than by the shine of skin." From that day on, Elric never again mentioned bathing in her presence, and followed her in silence, scribbling down her words as if collecting dew in clay cups. I'll admit, it was hard not to feel a touch of repulsion when she passed through the narrow abbey corridors. Her scent wasn't just of sweat, but of time itself, as though old leaves, dried leather, and a hint of burnt incense had taken root in her robes. But there was something more, something comforting, like the feel of a worn-out sheet still holding the warmth of an old embrace. The other nuns treated her gently, but kept their distance, as though fearing a single touch might dissolve her flesh into prayer. To me, she was a mystery, a living reliquary who refused to forget the body, even as she denied it the freshness of water. One night, while I was gathering lavender sprigs to fill the chapel cushions, I saw Sister Osberta seated beneath the bare cherry tree, gazing silently at the clouded sky. The mist wrapped around her like a cloak, and the stars, timid, seemed to flee her gaze. I approached gently, not wanting to shatter the dreamlike stillness, and when she noticed me, she didn't turn. She only murmured, "Tonight is St. Benvindo's night. It was on this date that I left the world of perfumes and gave myself to silence." I sat beside her, and we remained there, two shadows beneath the bare branches, sharing the cold like sacred bread. She spoke, her voice slow as the tower's bell, of a childhood among dyers. The scent of crushed flowers and pigments had been her first language. "But all color stains and every perfume lies," she said with a sad smile. Bathing, for her, was a dangerous luxury, a slippery bridge to pride. Since then, she took only one kind of bath, a smoke bath. She burned rue leaves, rosemary, and dried petals beneath her habit, letting the smoke swirl between her skin and the cloth, invisible veils of spiritual protection. "That's how I cleanse myself without corruption," she concluded, closing her eyes as if sealing a confession. That night, I returned to my room with the scent of rue clinging to my sleeves and a feeling I couldn't quite name resting in my chest. There was something deeply human in Osberta's refusal, a kind of quiet courage, not shouted, but shown in the details, in the way she folded the altar linens, in the steadiness of her hands while grinding herbs, and in the calm with which she bore the sideways glances of those who would never understand her choice. I watched her for months afterward and learned that fasting, when true, is not an absence. It is a deeper presence. She did not bathe, it's true. But she washed the world with her small, steady acts. Some young women from the village would visit her in secret, especially when plague whispered through alleyways or when love wounded more than it healed. She prepared infusions in clay pots, wrapped blessings in cloths, and taught that the body speaks even without soap. Sweat is the salt of the soul, she'd say, offering compresses of vinegar and dried flowers. The women left changed, not clean perhaps, but lighter, as though dirt, so feared and judged, had become a silent sanctuary where pain could rest without shame. In her presence, even the strongest odors seemed to carry a prayer. There was a year when the Black Plague threatened to breach the monastery's stone walls. The monks fortified the gates, burned herbs at the doors, and suspended all visits. While many bathed in boiling vinegar water and recited psalms in panic, Sister Osberta remained still, like an ancient rock forgotten by time. She believed and said without fear that dirt, gathered with humility and intention, formed a spiritual armor against both pride and death. Vanity opens doors that silence closes, she would repeat. And though some mocked her behind her back, no one dared enter her cell, where the air was thick with bay leaves and unshakable faith. When the worst had passed and the illness never reached our monastery, many, in secret, began to imitate her rituals. I saw young nuns hiding their soaps, gathering mugwort under the moon. What once was ridicule had become reverence. Not that everyone stopped bathing, but they began to see, in her refusal, a lesson about the body and its limits, about silence and its strength. Sister Osberta never spoke of it. She simply continued as always, bare feet on cold stone, hands busy with infusions and prayer, eyes turned inward, where perhaps lived the only cleansing she ever deemed necessary. One spring morning, we were told Sister Osberta had fallen ill. It wasn't plague nor fever, just a gentle weariness, like one who had given everything to time. I was asked to bring her a chalice of warm milk with honey, and when I entered her cell, I was enveloped in a strange warmth, not of fire but of memory. The air was thick, perfumed with resins and dried flowers, and every object seemed placed with intention. She was lying there, eyes closed, smiling as if in quiet conversation with an angel. At my light touch, she opened her eyes and whispered, "The last water I will see is that which falls from your eyes." The next day they prepared her body for burial. The sisters, in reverence, did not attempt to wash her. They simply wrapped her in raw linen and placed a sprig of rosemary, the herb of remembrance, between her hands. When the bell tolled one last time, we all knew we were not burying just a woman, but an ancient way of being. The earth welcomed her body gently, as if recognizing a long-awaited return. And for many winters after, it was said that when the wind passed through the convent windows, it carried the scent of rue and dry wood, as if Sister Osberta still wandered the halls, caring for souls with the same grace with which she refused the water. Over time, her story grew into legend. Some younger sisters began leaving small offerings at her grave, a piece of soap wrapped in cloth, a dried flower, a note with promises of humility. They said that on nights of doubt, you only had to sit there and wait. The breeze would bring a word, a whisper, or simply the silent comfort of knowing that someone long ago had chosen simplicity as a shield and faith as her fragrance. And there is no perfume more lasting than the one you cannot see, only feel as if it rose from the soul itself. Today, when I close my eyes and remember Sister Osberta, I don't think of the scent, or the veils, or the dark corridors where she walked. I think of peace, of the quiet steadiness of someone who lived true to herself, even when the world asked otherwise. In a time when cleanliness was fear and vanity a sin, she chose to carry her body like a candle, silent, but always lit. And when sleep touches me, soft as a linen veil, I sometimes imagine it is she who stirs the embers of the night, reminding us that there is beauty, too, in what does not shine.